The dawn was pale and grey, the kind of light that made the town look as though it had been carved out of ash. Clara Finch came stumbling down the dirt road, clutching an old patchwork quilt around her body as if it were armor. Her feet were blistered, her hair uncombed, her face drawn thin by nights without sleep. The wagon that had once carried her westward dreams lay splintered on the trail behind her, wheels broken, canvas slashed. What the road had not taken, the bandits had stolen. They had stripped her of food, tools, clothing, stripped her even of dignity, laughing as they rode away while she scrambled for the quilt she now clutched like a second skin. The town rose before her in silence, wood buildings crouched against the cold wind, chimneys exhaling smoke that smelled of coffee and bacon. To Clara it seemed every eye found her at once. Men paused with bridles in hand, women stepped down from porches with laundry still wet in their arms, children peeked out from behind barrels and fence rails. Their stares were heavy, sharp as stones, and in their faces she read not pity but suspicion. Whispers followed her steps. Words about shame, bad luck, God's punishment. Someone muttered that a woman who walked into town wrapped in a blanket alone had no right to call herself decent. Clara kept her eyes on the ground, on the pattern of her boots leaving shallow prints in the dust. She wanted to speak, to tell them she had been a wife once, that she had known a man's kindness before he was buried beneath prairie sod. But the words withered in her throat. To them, she was already judged. The sheriff passed by on the boardwalk but did not stop. A merchant shook his head as if swatting away a fly. Even the women, who might have understood, drew their shawls tighter, unwilling to be seen near her. Clara's chest ached. She had endured the cruelty of the men on the trail, but this quiet rejection, was heavier still. Then, from the edge of the crowd, she felt it, a gaze that did not burn but steadied. Leaning against a hitching post stood a man with a broad hat pulled low, coat dusted from the trail. His face was weathered, marked by an old scar that tugged one side of his mouth down into something between sorrow and silence. He did not join the whispering. He did not turn away. He simply watched her, his eyes dark and still, like the earth after rain. She faltered beneath his stare, thinking perhaps he too would look through her, but instead he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, the leather of his boots creaking. Without a word, he shrugged off his long coat and held it out to her. The weight of it startled her, warm, smelling faintly of smoke and horse. Clara clutched the coat to her chest. For the first time in many days, she felt covered, not only against the wind but against the shame that had followed her into town. She lifted her eyes to meet his. He gave no speech, offered no smile, only a quiet nod before turning back toward the shadows of the street. Around her, the townsfolk muttered, uneasy at the sight of the exchange. Some spat into the dirt, others whispered more sharply. Yet their voices mattered less now. For in that small act, a coat laid across her shoulders, she had been seen not as ruin, but as a woman worth shielding. She lingered in the street, quilt beneath the coat, dust curling at her feet like smoke. The man had not given her a name, and she had not dared ask. But she would remember his eyes, steady, unreadable, yet carrying a kind of mercy she had thought the world no longer held. The road of survival still stretched before her, barren and merciless. She knew she could not rely on kindness alone. She would need to gather strength from within, to stand against the silence of this town and the emptiness of her loss. Yet even in her loneliness, Clara felt a flicker of warmth, fragile as a candle in the wind. Not all men were cruel. Somewhere in this hard land, perhaps she was not entirely alone. The shack they gave her sat at the far edge of town, as if distance itself could separate her from the rest. It leaned against the prairie wind, its boards warped and graying, a roof patched with tin that rattled each time a gust swept through. Inside, dust lay heavy over a broken table, a cold hearth, and a rocking chair that creaked when she touched it, as though some ghost still kept watch. Clara set her quilt on the floor that first night and stared at the shadows gathering along the corners, listening to the prairie grass sigh against the walls. Her husband's presence lingered in every silence. She remembered the way his hands had worked rough wood into fences, the way his laughter used to chase away long evenings. Now only his old hammer lay rusting in her trunk, its handle split, its purpose forgotten. She touched it often, not for what it could build, but for the weight of memory it carried. The ache of his absence pressed on her chest, so sharp she sometimes found herself speaking to him, whispering questions into the dark. Why did you leave me with nothing? Why must I walk this road alone? The shack never answered. Each morning she rose with the sun, braided her hair with careful, trembling fingers, each twist a fragile attempt at order. The braid became her tether, a ritual against unraveling. She swept the dirt floor, scrubbed at stains that would never come clean, stacked stones inside the hearth though no fire yet burned. Dignity, she told herself, could be rebuilt piece by piece, like a house stitched together from ruins. Elias Boone she saw only from afar. He worked the land that stretched beyond town, moving with the steady rhythm of a man who had long ago made peace with solitude. His hat brim hid his eyes, his scar made him unreadable. Children whispered about him when they thought she could not hear, that he had killed men in the war, that he once rode with outlaws who burned their names into the plains. Some said he had lived among the Apache, others that he had betrayed both sides and was cursed for it. Clara listened in silence, unsure what was truth and what was fear. But in the quiet of her evenings, she found signs of him. A small sack of coffee beans appeared on her doorstep one morning, tied with twine. A bundle of kindling was laid neatly by the door another day, dry and clean though rain had fallen the night before. Once, when the wind cut colder, she found a shawl folded across the rocking chair, its weave strong though worn. Each gift came without sound, without footstep or knock. He left them as though the prairie itself had offered them up. At first, she felt a prick of anger. Charity was another form of shame, a reminder that she was seen as weak, as a beggar. But when she held the shawl to her shoulders that night, she found warmth where she thought none remained. She brewed the coffee and drank it slowly, its bitterness a comfort she had almost forgotten. And as the kindling caught flame at last in her hearth, she sat in the rocking chair and felt a flicker of something more than mere survival. She never saw him linger, never heard him claim the gestures. The man gave nothing of himself but these quiet offerings. Yet each night when she braided her hair by the firelight, she found her thoughts circling back to him, his silence, his watchful eyes, his distance that felt strangely protective. Clara did not know why he cared, nor what debts he carried that bound him to her. But she began to sense she was not entirely unguarded. The loneliness remained, sharp as the edge of winter, but it no longer seemed infinite. Dignity could be gathered from scraps, an ember coaxed from ashes, a shawl laid over weary shoulders, a braid that held fast even when trembling hands tied it. Clara had been left behind, abandoned by death and by cruelty, yet in the shadows of her grief she began to sense another presence. He was a man no one trusted, a man the town whispered against. And yet, unseen, he stood between her and the cold. The storm rose without warning, carried on a black horizon that swallowed the last light of day. Clara sat by her weak fire, braid undone, watching the rafters tremble as wind forced its way through every crack in the shack. Dust lifted from the corners and swirled around her. The single rocking chair groaned against the floorboards as if some unseen weight pressed it back and forth. When the first sheet of rain struck, it came like thrown gravel, stinging against the tin patches of the roof. Water found the seams and began to drip onto her quilt, onto her hair, onto the hearth where the fire hissed and died. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching her shawl, listening to the shack moan. The storm's voice was a chorus of rage, wind tearing, wood cracking, the sky splitting with thunder. She thought of her husband's grave, far to the east, and whispered a prayer she had not spoken since his burial. The walls shuddered as if about to collapse, and she felt the truth, the shack would not hold. Then through the howl came another sound, the low thud of hooves. Lantern light swung wild through the rain, throwing gold against the grey. The door burst open and there he was, soaked to the bone, hat dripping, eyes steady against the storm. Elias Boone filled the doorway as though he had been carved from the night itself. He said nothing, only stepped forward, caught her arm, and pulled her to her feet with a strength that brooked no refusal. The world blurred as he wrapped his coat around her shoulders and led her into the storm. Rain struck her face, her braid plastered to her back, but his hand was steady at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. She clung to the horn, quilt bunched between them, while he swung up behind her. The horse surged forward, hoofs pounding against the sodden earth, each strike muffled by the storm's roar. She dared one glance back and saw her shack collapsing in the distance, boards giving way, firelight swallowed by the rain. For a moment she felt grief. Though it had been little more than ruin, it had been hers. Then the image vanished into darkness, and all that remained was the heat of his chest against her back, the lantern swinging from his saddle, and the storm driving them onward. When at last they reached his cabin, she was half frozen, half breathless. He pulled her down, guided her inside, and shut the door on the thunder's voice. Silence fell, broken only by the steady crackle of fire already burning on his hearth. The air was thick with the scent of damp leather, tobacco, and coffee grounds that waited in a tin on the shelf. She stood dripping on his floor, quilt heavy with rain, and felt like an intruder in a place carved from another man's solitude. Elias moved with quiet certainty. He set the lantern aside, tossed more wood onto the flames, and fetched a blanket from a chest. When he placed it over her shoulders, his scarred face showed nothing of pity, only the practical gesture of one who knew how to outlast storms. Yet when his eyes met hers, dark, unreadable, she saw not indifference, but something haunted, something careful, as though kindness were a burden he had carried too long in silence. Clara lowered herself into a chair near the fire. Heat spread slowly into her bones, chasing away the storm's bite, but unease lingered. She was alone in a stranger's world, surrounded by tools, rifles, a man's life she did not know. She traced the braided ropes hanging by the door, the worn boots set neatly aside, the careful order that spoke of discipline born from solitude. He lived as though expecting no one, yet she had been brought here as if some place had been waiting for her all along. He poured coffee into a tin cup, placed it on the table beside her, and returned to his seat across the fire. The light carved his face into planes of shadow and ember, highlighting the scar, the hollow of his eyes. For a long time neither spoke. Only the fire cracked, the rain tapped on the windows, the storm bellowed beyond. She lifted the cup, hands shaking, and drank. The bitterness filled her throat, sharp but grounding. Gratitude settled in her chest, tangled with unease. She had depended on no one since her husband's death, had lived by scraps and silence. Yet tonight, with her shack broken and her pride nearly drowned, she sat alive only because of him. Clara's heart tightened with the truth. She feared this dependence, yet something within her leaned toward it. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, wild, destructive, yet driving her into the shelter of another soul. She did not know what this man carried, what secrets haunted him, but she sensed already that his silence was not emptiness. It was a guard, a shield. Perhaps, if she allowed it, healing could come not from isolation but from standing in another's shadow until the storm passed. She sat by the fire, braid loosened, shawl steaming, watching the flames shift against his silent face. For the first time in many nights, she did not feel utterly alone. The storm gave way at last, leaving the plains washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Days stretched into weeks, and Clara remained beneath Elias Boone's roof. She told herself it was only until she could stand on her own, until her wagon could be mended, until she gathered the strength to move forward. Yet each morning she found herself waking to the rhythm of his cabin, the scrape of his boots as he stepped outside, the creak of the pump handle as he drew water, the sound of a man who lived as if every task mattered. They lived in silence, a kind of wordless treaty. She tended the fire, kept the cabin swept, and mended his torn shirts by the hearth. Her fingers pricked with each stitch, not from clumsiness but from the strange intimacy of sewing another man's clothes. At times she would glance up and see him outside, shoulders bent as he worked on the wagon wheel, or leading his horse to water. Their lives wove together in quiet, like two threads twisted without knot. Yet the tension lingered. When she went into town for flour, she felt the eyes upon her. Women whispered behind their hands, men spat into the dust with knowing smirks. To live beneath another man's roof, and not her husband's, was a brand of shame she carried like a scarlet mark. She returned each time with her jaw set, cheeks burning, and said nothing to Elias. But at night, lying awake beneath his roof, she felt the weight of it pressing down. He did not ask her to stay. He did not press her to go. His silence was steady, like stone, and at times it angered her. Did he not understand how the whispers cut? Did he not care? And yet, when she woke in the morning to find more wood stacked by the hearth or water drawn in the bucket, she knew his silence was not neglect but something else, something harder to name. One evening, when the air was cool and the light slanted gold across the plains, she found him at the table with a pot of coffee between them. He poured her a cup, the steam rising in the quiet, and for a long while they drank without words. Then, at last, his voice broke the silence. He told her of the war, of riding under a flag that shifted with the wind, of blood spilled on both sides of a land too wide for graves. He spoke of Apache warriors who had once fought beside him, who had taught him the ways of the land, who had called him brother. He spoke of how the townsfolk branded him a traitor for it, how vengeance had followed him home. His family, he said simply, had not survived the reprisal. Clara listened, her hands folded tight around the cup, the firelight flickering across his scar. His words were not long, not detailed, but every one carried the weight of memory too heavy to bear alone. In his voice she heard her own grief reflected back, the sudden silence of a home without laughter, the way death stripped not only the body but the very shape of life itself. When he fell quiet, she did not answer with platitudes. Instead, she told him of her husband, of the years of toil and small joys, of the day she buried him beneath the prairie grass. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. By the end, her braid had loosened, and tears streaked the dust on her cheeks. They sat together, the fire crackling low, two people scarred in different ways, yet scarred all the same. In the stillness that followed, something fragile was born. Not trust entirely, not love, but an understanding, a recognition that loneliness was a mirror they both had been forced to face. Clara realized then that Elias's silence was not indifference. It was the burden of memory, the shield of a man who had endured too much to speak lightly. And in that realization, she felt her own weight lift slightly, as if by sharing the silence she no longer carried it alone. The town would go on whispering, and shame would cling like smoke, but within the walls of that cabin the world seemed to soften. Two souls, both cast out, had begun to find a strange kind of belonging, not in promises, not in declarations, but in the quiet act of sitting across from each other while the night closed in. The days settled into a rhythm, quiet yet threaded with something unspoken. Elias went about his work with the same measured steps, his silence a constant companion, while Clara found herself drawn into the shape of his life. She tended the hearth, mended what she could, and learned the ways of the land through his example. It was not marriage, nor courtship, nor anything that the town could name. It was something smaller, subtler, like a seed pressing upward through hard soil. One afternoon he placed a rifle in her hands. The weight startled her, it felt too heavy, too final, but his presence steadied her. He stood behind her, his scarred hands guiding hers, his voice low and firm as the wind cut sharp across the plain. "Breathe," he said. The rifle was cold against her cheek, her braid whipped loose in the prairie gusts, but she held her aim as he told her. The shot cracked across the open sky, echoing back from nowhere, and when she lowered the gun she found her shoulders trembling less than before. He said nothing more, only nodded once, and the pride that rose in her chest was quiet but fierce. Later, when he struggled with frayed rope, she showed him how to braid it anew from strips of old cloth. Her fingers worked with care, twisting and folding as he watched, his large hands clumsy with the delicate task. She guided him patiently, laughing softly when he tangled the strands. For a moment the weight between them eased, and he allowed the hint of a smile to touch his face. The rope, knotted and imperfect, hung by the door like a sign of their shared labor. Yet peace on the frontier never lingered long. Word spread that riders had been seen again, the same bandits who had left Clara broken and shamed. She felt the old fear stirring in her chest, but this time it did not paralyze her. It sharpened her resolve, made her fingers itch for the rifle Elias had placed in her hands. They came at dusk, their laughter cruel, their words sharper still. They called her by the name they had mocked her with before, dragging it through the dust of the street. Men lingered in doorways, unwilling to intervene, their silence almost as cutting as the bandits' jeers. Clara stood rigid in the firelight spilling from the tavern windows, her shawl pulled tight, the old wound of humiliation reopening with every sound. Then Elias stepped forward. He did not shout, did not curse. He carried no bravado, only a rifle cradled steady in his hands. His figure cut against the firelight, tall and immovable, the scar on his face marked deeper by shadow. The bandits' laughter faltered as his silence pressed against them heavier than any words could. He leveled the gun with the same calm he had taught her, breathe, aim, steady, and in his stance she saw no hesitation. He was not warning them for her sake alone. He was standing in the place where cruelty had struck before, and declaring it would not strike again. Clara's heart pounded as the standoff stretched taut. She felt the town's eyes on her, waiting to see her flinch, waiting to see him falter. Instead she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and stepped closer to his side. The firelight danced across her face, and for the first time she felt no shame in standing visible before them. The bandits spat their threats into the dust, but under the weight of his silence and the steady aim of his rifle, they drew back, muttering as they mounted their horses. The night swallowed their retreat, hoofbeats fading into the plains. Clara released the breath she had held, her body trembling with the rush of fear and relief. She looked at Elias then, truly looked, and in his eyes she saw what she had not dared name. He had not shielded her out of pity, nor out of duty. His silence had always been more than absence, it had been a vow. He had stood between her and the world because something within him refused to let her break. The firelight flickered against them both, casting their shadows long across the street. Clara felt something shift inside her, as steady and fierce as the crack of that rifle on the plain. She was no longer the abandoned widow who had stumbled into town beneath whispers and scorn. She was a woman worth standing for. And Elias Boone, scarred and silent, was the man who would stand with her. The morning broke pale and thin, the sky streaked with the grey of retreating night. Clara rose before the town stirred, shawl wrapped tight, rifle in hand. Elias waited at the edge of the livery, his face carved hard by purpose, his body taut with the weight of what had to be done. They did not speak as she mounted behind him, her hands clutching the leather of his coat. Words were no longer needed. The storm that had once kept them strangers had carried them here, side by side, to face the ones who had carved her shame into the dust. The plain spread out before them, wide and merciless. The bandits were waiting at the far edge, their silhouettes jagged against the rising sun. They lounged with the swagger of men who believed the land belonged to them, laughter rough on the wind. Clara's heart thundered, but she felt Elias steady beneath her, as immovable as the hills. He slid from the saddle with a grunt, rifle in hand, and she followed, her own hands shaking as they wrapped around cold iron. Gunfire split the dawn. The sound was not grand nor glorious, it was jagged, brutal, sharp as tearing cloth. Dust rose in choking clouds, horses shrieked, and men cursed as bullets snapped through the air. Clara pressed against the earth, her breath ragged, each shot thudding like a hammer inside her chest. She saw Elias move through the chaos with the steadiness he had taught her, breathe, aim, fire. His silence was his weapon, his defiance written not in words but in the rhythm of survival. When it ended, the plain lay still, the horizon glowing faintly with morning light. Bodies sprawled where laughter had been, the bandits scattered or silenced forever. Clara pushed herself to her feet, ears ringing, lungs burning with the taste of dust. Elias stood swaying, his rifle still in hand, blood soaking through his shirt. He caught her gaze and tried to straighten, but his knees buckled. She ran to him, catching his weight as he slid from the horse. His blood spread warm and heavy across her shawl, staining it dark, but she did not falter. The town had begun to gather at the edge of the plain, their faces pale in the newborn light. Eyes that had once looked at her with pity or scorn now watched as she held Elias upright, her arms locked tight around him. She did not lower her head. She did not shrink beneath their gaze. Her voice rang clear, steadier than she knew she possessed, "He is mine to carry home." And in those words she felt the chains of silence break. No longer the widow abandoned, no longer the woman whispered about in doorways. She was Clara, scarred, but unbroken, her dignity reclaimed not in secrecy but in defiance, in the simple act of standing at his side. Together they mounted the horse, Elias's arm heavy across her shoulders. Each step of the animal was slow, deliberate, the land rolling beneath them as the sun climbed higher. The air smelled of blood and smoke, yet the light grew warmer, stretching golden across the grass. Clara felt the weight of him lean against her, not as savior to saved, nor protector to protected, but as one scarred soul against another. The road home was long, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything they had endured, everything they had chosen. The rocking chair would not creak alone anymore. The hearth would no longer burn cold. As the cabin came into view, the first true light of morning touched its roof, and Clara understood, love does not roar. It waits in silence, grows from broken pieces, and when the dust settles, it rides home steady as the sunrise.